Hello, and welcome to Philosophy Fools, a bi-weekly podcast where a young father and old bachelor talk about life, philosophy, and staying curious. This week, Nephew Josh and Uncle Greg discuss the origin story for the podcast, what we want it to be, and what's in it for you. Hope that sounds good, because that's what we're doing.
Good morning, Uncle Greg. How's it going?
Hey, good morning, Josh. Everything's going great here. How about yourself?
I am doing well. Just waking up on this beautiful Sunday morning and getting ready for our first episode of the Philosophy Fools. I'm very excited.
Yeah,
And I
you and me
just
both.
think we should. Oh man, I'm pumped. So let's just get right into it. Who are we? My name is Josh Lemons. I am married. I've been married for 5 years. I've been with my wife for 10 years. I'm in my mid 30s and I have two little kids, a 4-year-old daughter and a 1-year-old son. I love things like golf. I try and golf every week, and that's one of my passions. I am in the data center world as my career. So right now I've been doing that for almost 8 years, and I've had 3 or 4 different types of positions there, and basically that just pays the bills for me.
Uh-huh.
I've also been a personal trainer for the past 5 years, which is something I really love, and it gives me joy and passion, and every single day I do it, I feel like I'm not working. So it's great, but I don't know if that is my true life passion. And that's one of something that I do on a daily basis, is trying to figure out what my love in life is. And right now for me, my wife and kids are pretty much the biggest part of my life. And so I love being a dad, and I love being a father, and I love being a husband, and that's kind of me in a nutshell right now.
Yeah,
Um,
excellent. Well, and it sounds to me, Josh, that and oh wait, let me introduce myself. My name's Greg Gillis. I'm Josh's uncle, and I'm in my late 50s. I'm a bachelor. I have almost no responsibilities. I have the responsibilities of a 14-year-old boy, and it's a life that I really enjoy living. And I'm currently on a sabbatical from my work, and I'll be heading back into the workforce soon. But in addition to that, I've been pretty much everything over my life. I've worked a million jobs. I've enjoyed pretty much all of them, but I have found that I tend to have a very curious mind, and I tend to want to continue to find new adventures as I sort of work through things. And so you and I both share an early passion for working out and working as trainers. I was doing it a good 20 years before you were born, and it was a lot of fun then, and it sounds like it's still a lot of fun for you now. But in addition to that, I started my life really wanting to be a professional illustrator. I got to a point in my career in my early 30s where I had pretty much been a professional illustrator and also an art director. And as things had it, I just kind of drifted into the technology biz. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been working in a number of different disciplines. Primarily is this concept of being a user experience designer. So essentially, anything you see on a computer, those are the things that I do. I don't do the stuff in the background. I do the things that you see when you're on your computer. So that's me in a nutshell. And but the reason I jumped in when I did was it sounded like when you were talking about your life, it sounded very much like our mission statement for this podcast, which is being kind of curious about what comes next and what are the things that we value and what are the things that we want to see our next step being. And that we, as a couple of guys, are people who want to do that in a conscious way and not in kind of just an accidental way.
yeah, that's very true, because I think the biggest thing for me over the past 10 or 15 years is that I've been doing everything in just an accidental way almost, and it hasn't been planned. And I think if I went back and did it again, I hate to say that because you don't learn anything unless you haven't done it. So everything I've done is great, but the data center world, I don't know if that's my passion, and I don't even know if personal training is my passion. And so just thinking about that and talking about that with you and everything is something that I think is very valuable for me and just for you. I mean, I know you went from being a trainer and being in the an art director and a graphic designer and everything to being is it user UX designer? Is that what it's
But
called?
yes, that's what we call
Yeah. Do you get to use your creativity in that job?
Absolutely. And weirdly, I think the most important lesson for all of us to learn is that you can use all of your creativity in whatever you do. It's really just a question of whether or not it's going to meet the sort of expectations and the desires that you have. Like, what are your goals in doing whatever? Because I have been very creative when I was a personal trainer. It just was a different kind of creativity than when you create a magazine or when you create software for a corporation. But they all require a certain degree of bringing your full self to the table, and a big part of that is your creativity and your passion.
Now, were you thinking about these things when you moved from like the art world into the technology world? Like, or was it money driven when you changed jobs, or what was your mindset back then?
Well, actually, to be truthful, I don't think I actually began to think until I was around 40, but that was an acquired skill after a period of time. But to answer your question, early on, it was very much a passion driven process where I'd start a thing, I'd really get into it. And then I would, since I really didn't have any clear goals out of what I was trying to do, when I worked in the gym environment and helped to manage gyms, and some friends of mine had me come out to Indianapolis to run some gyms for them there. It was after all of the excitement kind of wore off and it became kind of a workaday world that I sort of stood up and said, "Hey, wait a second, this isn't super interesting. I want to try something else. I want to get back to my passion." So that's when I moved back to become an illustrator and an art director. And at the end of that, I was like, "Oh wow, this isn't what I thought it was going to be." But when it came down to brass tacks, I didn't have a very clear picture of what I wanted that to be. So my quote disappointment in that career was really, I think, a result of not really thinking about where I wanted it to go to begin with. And that's when I say I started to think in my 40s, I truly had a lot of kind of running around trying to put out fires in my life, and so a lot of my time was spent trying to correct things like the amount of debt I got myself into, and it sort of removed that sense of having sort of big life goals that I wanted to pursue. And so it was only after I had a huge paradigm shift in my late 30s where I had removed all of the financial debt that I had accrued over my early 30s, that I woke up one morning and looked around and said, "Hey, wait a second. All of the things that I thought about needing a job were changed a lot because I'd spent almost 10 years trying to pay off debts. And so all of a sudden, when the debts were gone, I was making a huge amount of money because I was in the habit of giving all that money away during the debt repayment. And then all of a sudden I was paying myself all that money. And it caused a huge shift in my outlook on why I went to work. And that led to a good 15 years of being able to just jump in and jump out of work because of what I wanted to do instead of because I had to.
Yeah, it's that's one thing that I think I'm realizing being in my mid 30s is that there's all these little, I guess, traps you can call them, like debt and now family responsibility is not a trap at all. That's a choice, and that's something that gives me most of my joy.
Mhm.
But having a family and having debt and everything like that definitely controls a lot of my options,
Mhm.
in a sense that I mean, I need to make X amount of money or my kids are not going to have food, or we're not going to have a house, or XYZ, and that hinders my creativity sometimes when it comes to exactly what I want to do, or at least searching for what I want to do. And having these talks with you is awesome, and definitely helps me think about that more. And so that's definitely something that this podcast, and I think is going to be valuable for myself, and maybe our audience, is just to kind of define what we want to do, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah, and same here. And I think that leads really well into our next topic, which is the like why are we doing this podcast? Because as we work through this concept of the who, what, when, and where of our podcast and why, it's important that as you and I look at our lives, you're at a point where you've got a lot of runway ahead of you, and I've got a lot less runway ahead of me, but I've got a lot of experience looking back, and that I'm really hoping that I can share that with you and share that with our listeners as we go. But that when it comes down to brass tacks, what we just laid out is the why of this podcast, which is life changes, life continues to evolve forward. Things that you deal with when you're 34 will change and shift when you're 40, and they'll change and shift when you're 50, and they'll change and shift when you're 60. That doesn't make it wrong. What it does mean is that you need, and we all need, a good framework to deal with all these changes and all these shifts and all these ups and downs of life, so that we don't get defeated by them, and at the same time that we're always in a position to make decisions about the life we want to live.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, I mean, I feel like I'm living a good life, and I want to live a better life. And I know I'm 35, and some people will think that old is old. Some people will think that is young, and it really just depends. But I really want to uh, take every day and make it better. And without having these definitions in place, and reading some philosophy and figuring out what's going on in life, like I've just been bouncing around from job to job, basically thinking about money, and how I'm going to support my family. When in all actuality, most of these jobs and everything are not giving me joy or anything like that. And for me, I know that that's very important to me. And so I know one reason that we're doing this podcast is basically to give us different steps and actions that I can take or you can take to make life a little better. And it's not even an action, it's also tools that we can have that you can look back on and say, oh, now I can do XYZ, or well, I created this framework for my job, and even though today stinks and I want to quit, well, I'm doing it for XYZ reasons.
Uh-huh.
And that's a why for me, is just that it'll give me something actionable to do every day, to get through life, or make life better.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing for me in terms of why to do this podcast is that it gives you and I a chance to talk in a way that we oftentimes don't. We're oftentimes just relegated to visiting each other on holidays or birthdays. And that's a very different kind of relationship than what I think this having a regular conversation gives us an opportunity to do, which is to get to know each other better. And frankly, I just like to talk to you. So this is just a great fun excuse for us to get together on a regular basis.
Yeah, absolutely. It reminds me of 20 years ago or so, like between the ages of like 13 and 17, you and I would go and see a movie and do lunch fairly often. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, maybe once every 2 months or so.
Yeah.
And I always remember those conversations because I never had a framework, or I didn't understand any of that. Like back in the day, I would just go to school and watch movies and not really think anything of my life because I was always pretty good at school
Hmm.
and taking tests and everything. I never really had any issues with that, but none of that stuff really prepares you for life at all. And
Right.
so some of those conversations, it really doesn't. And we had those conversations at different lunches that I remember, and I think this might have been even at the beginning of your quest of this life knowledge. But for me, you pointed out different books in my teens that I ignored for 5 or 10 years. But then when I finally started reading them and realizing that they were useful, 10 years later, it really started to help. So this podcast definitely reminds me of those younger times too.
Yeah, and I had a blast doing that too. Just because, if nothing else, we got to explore different restaurants and different types of food that we wouldn't normally get to see.
Yeah, absolutely. We used to go get Chinese food all the time and Thai food. You introduced me to Thai food when I was younger, and I never ate anything like that because my parents were never into Thai food. So, and Thai food is one of my favorite foods now. So I definitely enjoyed those times.
Well, my work is done. That's important. Got you into the Thai food, and but that's a good example. And I can't tell you how happy that makes me feel, because that's almost exactly what I thought would happen. Is that I would suggest a thing, you being in your mid to late teens would ignore it completely for a long period of time, and then you would come back around to it later, because that is absolutely what I did. My parents were really good about giving me unbelievably good life advice that I completely rejected until all of my failures stacked up enough that I realized I had to go back to basics. And so I would go back to what my parents said, and that was me in my late 20s. And all of a sudden, I started to be rational, or excuse me, semi-rational, and that was a big shift for me. And but it does bring up an interesting point, which is that you and I both really like to explore different ideas, reading different books, and just for the heck of it. Like we'll get into a philosophy text, or we'll get into a training text, or anything where we look at it and say, hey, this is kind of interesting. I wonder how we can incorporate this into our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for probably the past 5 years or so, I've been, in my opinion, going to school like kind of in my mind, like because I've been reading so much about philosophy, and it's not actual school like going to college or anything like that. But this is the first time in my life where I've seeked out knowledge, and it is really and it makes me think about my life, and that makes me happy, and I enjoy it. And so I'm excited to talk all this stuff out with you because you were the first person to introduce me to a lot of this, and you can make sense of a lot of this that honestly doesn't make sense to me. So that's another why for me. I'm just excited about it for sure.
Well, absolutely. And a lot of this is going to be a good example of how experience over time. I often disrespect the amount of experience that I have achieved over time, because every day I wake up, I realize, like, hey, wow, I've still got a lot to learn. But that in talking to you, I realize that there are things that I've picked up over the years that can be really helpful and handy to somebody who's in kind of a similar spot to where I was long, long ago.
It is funny because like I can remember times when I was 17 or 18 or even to 25 where I felt smart. Like I was like, I am a smart guy. Like I got this. And then now, like after, kind of what I was saying, I go into school for the past 5 years or learning as much as you can online because you can learn a ton of stuff as long as you are going to good literature and reading philosophy and reading old books and everything like that. You can certainly learn a lot. And now I feel dumb after all that. And so it's an interesting mindset shift from actually learning more to feeling like I know less now. So it's
Well,
just
I
philosophy
think,
is really fun.
yeah, I absolutely think that's the beginning of learning. Because if you already know everything, why would you learn? And so it's a healthy paradox for us as people to always remember there's something else that we can learn until we have achieved some this is the funny thing, is that I think people like that idea of saying like, hey, I've got it all figured out. And as you and I both learned through hard experience, that we in fact did not have everything figured out. And when reality stops being cooperative, that's when you have to start getting cooperative with reality. So that's I think that's what the philosophical journey is all about. So okay, well that sounds great. So that's the who and the why of our podcast. Let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about what we actually mean by philosophy and what we're going to be trying to do with this podcast. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Okay, we'll be back in a sec.
And we're back. All right, Uncle Greg. So we are talking about, when we say philosophy, what exactly do we mean? Now, do you think you can give us a kind of a basic definition of philosophy?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that you and I have gone back and forth on, because we did some beta podcasts, and one of the things that came up during our test runs is we started to notice that we were getting very focused in on the very specific idea of very specific philosophers. And that is itself one kind of definition of philosophy. But I think to make the conversations really good for you and me, but also to make them as broad as possible, that we should probably have a definition for philosophy that's also really broad. So I went out and looked for basic definitions, and the one that I found that I liked, that I think we can use as our marching orders for the podcast, is this idea of philosophy being the basic ideas about knowledge, right and wrong, reasoning, and the value of things. And that is essentially just an organized way of thinking about everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that gets it right down to the basics, because when we thought about this, like, my definitions of philosophy are a little bit different. I mean, are basically the same thing. Like, I'm trying to get value out of other people's thoughts about life, and that's the value of things. And with doing that, I'm figuring out what's right or wrong in my life, and different reasons why. So I think that definition is awesome. Now for me, what I don't like about philosophy, and what I see in other philosophy podcasts or philosophy texts when I'm looking online, is that everybody is always arguing about different points that the philosophers make.
Yeah.
And whether or not that argument is made up just for the fact that people like arguments and like conflict, but that, for me, philosophy, if we're reading a book and there's 20 different philosophy points, I just want to talk about what makes sense to me and what I can use in life, and what I can use as a tool. And I don't need to argue with you about different points that may or may not be true, because first of all, these philosophers are 500 years old, 1,000 years ago, and some of it just doesn't make sense anymore. And another reason is that I just don't really like to argue very much. So that's something that I don't want to do too much with you.
I am absolutely there with you. And the one thing that you're bringing up there is really important, which is it's another definition of philosophy is reviewing the texts of philosophers. It's a very academic pursuit, and that's where you get into arguments about, like, what did they mean by this word, and what do they mean by that word. And I think that that's great if you're a philosophy professor, but I think that you and I both are bringing to the table a really practical day-to-day use of these ideas. And that's why having a broad definition of philosophy is good for us, because otherwise you're kind of stuck into a strict reading of who a philosopher might be. And as stupid as this sounds, I'd find even people like Tony Robbins as a person who he is in many ways he's a big huckster, but he's got a lot to say about sort of practical day-to-day approaches to life. And so it's our job to look at what anybody says, anybody who's presenting themselves as a person who has an organized approach to life gives us an opportunity to look at what they say and then just discuss it and decide whether or not we think they are on to something or not.
I really like what you just said there, and because somebody like Tim Robbins or anything like that. I mean, sure they might be hucksters, but everyone these days needs to make money, and a lot, and they have good points. And what you said about they basically having organized ideas about life, I mean, is philosophy in a sense of today, because most people who are thinking about life today are generally trying to sell something,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, I think that's just something we just need to think about, and no matter who it is, whether it's philosophers of old or philosophers of new, we can take their data and just kind of see what we think about it, and see if it makes sense in our lives, and see if we can make our lives better with their tools. And that's just kind of philosophy for me.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where I think that this can be a lot of value to other people as well, because we really are looking at this very much through the lens of things that we find useful and that I really want us to be able to explore over time, these ideas, so that instead of just like going, hey, I read this thing and it sounds great, that we really dig in deeper and are able to say like, hey, in my life, this is how I can use this on any given day, or I remember when I was younger, and this would have been very helpful during this period of my life. So all of these things are things where you and I, at the bottom of all of this, the our definition of philosophy as we move forward will include a lot of classic philosophers, but we're also going to make sure that we expand this out so that we're really delving into philosophical ideas, no matter where they come from.
Perfect. I like it. And to make a point, to we're not experts in any of this stuff,
Do
you know
do.
but we do have a lot of life experiences, and I feel like we have good outlooks and good perspectives on life, and we've been reading philosophy for 5 years or so, or for a lot longer, I mean, for sure.
Yeah.
And so I definitely think that's a value, is that we're just normal guys talking about these philosophies, instead of experts, and so most people out there in the world are just normal people trying to go to work and pay their bills, and that's what we are, and that's what we're trying to do with the philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, if there's one thing I'm not trying to do is impress anybody with how much knowledge I've got about the Stoics. I am here just in sort of like a pursuit of a life that I consider to be a valuable life, and in the process, hopefully sharing ideas with other people so they can do exactly the same thing. Okay.
Awesome. I love it.
Okay, Josh. So now we've talked about what we mean by philosophy, and now what exactly are we going to do? Like, so how do we want to approach our Philosophy Fools podcast?
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll just give a basic one. Well, we're going to get together every other week to record an episode.
Okay, and I think that we agreed that each episode is either going to be inspired by a piece of philosophy, like an actual philosophy text, or what we're going to do is find a topic that either gets suggested by one of the texts we read, and maybe drill down deeper on just the idea that's presented. So we'll deal with both a text, and we'll also deal with just ideas.
Exactly, and that was one thing we learned in the beta episodes, was that it's awesome to read specific philosophy texts, but it's harder to just talk about that text if we're not getting into arguments or anything like that. What we found is that really what makes the biggest impact on us are the specific topics. And so I think that's a great idea, that because we aren't experts, like we were just saying, and we want this podcast to, we want to talk with each other, but we want everyone else out there to basically be our conversation buddies, and listen to us, and talk to us, and give us ideas, and explore your philosophy, and maybe create your own. And we're going to try and create our own to every week to make ourselves better.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a big and vital part of this is that we aren't trying to tell people what to do. We're trying to help people ask better questions than they're asking now. And if we can do that, that's going to be a real success for both of us. Because if we can do that for other people, we're doing it for ourselves too. And I think that as part of this, what we want to do is really look for how our topics can kind of, we were talking about before, which is how do these topics fit into our lives? So we don't just talk about them abstractly, but that we actually try and map the ideas that we discuss back to our day-to-day lives, and also try and keep in mind how this can help others as it can help us. So we're really just kind of keeping that idea together that there's a lot of value in these texts. We're going to see what value it has for us, but we also want to be really conscious of the kind of value we can share with other people.
Absolutely. And the value is, I think another value is that I'm in my mid 30s and you're in your 50s, and that's two different perspectives. I mean, I'm just starting, I'm in a different chapter of my life than you are, and we have different experiences. We have a lot of similar experiences too. And I think those are definitely going to be things that will help us, get some practical action steps that we can make, whether you're older or younger or in different parts of your life or in different, even for me going forward in my life. And that's 100% why I'm doing this.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, the one thing that I think we'll find just between ourselves, but also I think it's going to help other people, is that when you start to look at the gap between what it means to be 34, 35, and what it means to be 59, it's got a huge, that there's a lot of space in between. And I'm really hoping that you can start to see a path forward, and other people who maybe are 40 or 50 can start to see how that spectrum of experience from our younger years to our older years. Sometimes you learn a lot, and sometimes you just keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And the types of things that you and I'll be talking about will, at minimum, kind of help people if they've gotten themselves stuck in some kind of rut or into a way of thinking that kind of keeps them not super happy.
Yeah, exactly. We have these conversations, but I talk about some of this kind of stuff with people at my work who are very successful professionals, and a lot of them, have never even thought twice about a lot of this stuff. So I really do think that what we are talking about here is certainly valuable for people in the professional world, or people just starting their, like, teenagers and their late teens starting their life, and really just anybody who's seeking more knowledge, or wants to live a richer life. I think all this stuff is very valuable for.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the crazy things, and this is why it's important for us to always, I think, continue to amplify this message that this isn't just fancy pants. Ooh, look at us reading Marcus Aurelius. This is really about the idea of, hey, what was somebody thinking 2,000 years ago? If it's similar to what I'm thinking now, there's probably a deeper truth there, because a lot has changed in 2,000 years. And it's just a good example of don't reinvent the wheel when you don't have to.
Yeah, a lot of things have changed over the past 2,000 years, but it is funny how a lot of these texts relate to our lives, and how most of the world has not changed any part of their internal self. Even though we have all these awesome philosophy texts or anything like that, we're all still making the same mistakes, and so I think a lot of it is just behavior and being aware of these things and talking about these things on a weekly basis or biweekly basis, and really taking steps from what we learned and putting those into our lives, and it's super beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, if we keep ourselves honest and really continue to drill through these different ideas, that we can't help but help each other. And I'm really in hopes that it helps other people too. So I'm excited. I'm really looking forward to this.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's take a break. And when we're back, we'll talk about what's been on our minds this past week. Josh will have a segment on a big idea or big revelation associated with his journey as being a dad. And then I'll take a stab at coming up with kind of a big thought of the week or a big question for the week. Sound good?
All right, we'll be right back.
Okay, we're back. Before we go, I want to check in with Josh to see what lessons or insights he's had in the last week dealing with being a dad or pretty much anything. And then I'll wrap up with my thought of the week. So, Josh, what do you got?
All right, guys. So this week, Uncle Greg, so parenting is obviously hard, right? And in Philosophy Fools here, we're trying to take an approach like based on philosophy to insert things in your life, which is awesome. But recently I stumbled upon this app that takes like a more scientific approach to dealing with parenting, and I thought it would be cool to kind of bring it up. This app is called In Love with Parenting, and what it talks about is happiness chemicals in your body, and so
Oh,
and also stress chemicals in your body, and how important those are to keeping your kids and your wife and the whole family unit happy. And I thought it was pretty interesting to think about this because I usually don't think about the chemicals in our bodies, making a big difference in our family.
uh-huh.
Um, so what it talks about is control, and I'm not going to get too deep into this because I'm not a scientist, all right, but I
Okay.
just want to have awareness for people, to get on this app and to kind of learn about this because I think it's important. But what they talk about is controlling your cortisol levels. Cortisol is important for everybody, but it shouldn't be too high, and it causes a lot of stress.
Mhm.
And then it talks about two happiness chemicals that get produced in your body. Those are dopamine, which is a short-term happiness chemical, which most people have probably heard of.
Uh-huh.
If you go on Facebook and you get likes on Facebook, you're getting dopamine hits.
Uh-huh.
If you I don't know, if you're an addict and you take your drag on your cigarette, you're getting a dopamine hit. Anything that really makes you happy, you get these small dopamine hits that make you super super happy.
Uh-huh.
But the problem with too much dopamine is that it deregulates your system, and if you have too much dopamine too often, then the happiness levels in your body goes down. And the app will explain that a little bit more, and it tells you to focus on the third chemical that I want to talk about is oxytocin, which is a long-term happiness chemical.
Uh-huh.
And simple, very very simple things in your family life can make this better. Like, I don't know if anyone listening has their wife or their significant other, and maybe one person sits in the recliner at night and one person sits in the couch at night.
Uh-huh.
Now, you guys aren't touching or anything like that, and so your oxytocin levels are actually not doing anything. Maybe even cortisol levels could be going up if you're thinking bad thoughts or something like that,
Uh-huh.
and that's not good. And so, one thing that the app teaches is that simply sitting next to your wife or your significant other and holding hands or just literally just touching
Uh-huh.
increases this oxytocin in your body.
Mhm.
And and your oxytocin level, if you keep it at a higher level, it regulates your happiness. It's not like dopamine where you'll be super happy if you get a present, you'll get
Yeah.
super happy and that's the happiest you'll be, but that's not your real happiness. So they talk about like hugging your kid 38 times in a day, like things like that, and holding hands, telling them that you love them, spending time together, being open with them is much more important and increases that oxytocin chemical.
Oh, that's great. Now, do you now when you have you begun to try and put this into practice yet, or are you very early with this?
I am very early with this, but I am trying to, like, so say at night, if my wife and I are laying in bed, even working on our laptop or watching TV, I'll always try and get closer and hold hands now.
Okay.
Um, with the kids, I mean, I'm always every single time I see him, I say hello, I love you, and I try and give him a hug, like get on my knees and give him a hug.
Uh-huh.
um I feel like it has been helping, because I've been doing that for, let's say, probably about 3 weeks now. And so I know with my youngest one, the 4 year old, if you just give her love all the time,
Uh-huh.
she'll be happier. She's noticeably happier.
Oh.
And when you yell, like if you're constantly nitpicking at a kid, which you can, I mean, you can nitpick a kid
Sure.
every single sentence they say, but that increases their cortisol levels really high, and you can see their stress and their response, like it is crazy. And then on top of that, if you give them something like a piece of chocolate and their dopamine level shoots up right after that chocolate,
Uh-huh.
within 30 minutes of that, my daughter is out of control. And what I mean by that is that we'll be talking to her and she might start crying, or she'll be really happy and then she'll start crying. And so I can really notice, like when she gets something like a dopamine hit and it comes down, like her balances are way off, because a
Yeah.
4 year old can't control their emotions. So it's just the chemicals in their body is basically telling them what to do at that point.
Oh, interesting. So that's something that I think, like that sounds like a really great discipline. If nothing else, it sort of makes you pay attention to how your actions affect other people. And I think a lot of times people don't pay any attention. So I think that's awesome. And does this app, does this sound like something that you like? How long during the week do you expose yourself to the app? Is it like 15 minutes a week, or what? How do you use it?
The past 3 weeks, I mean, I haven't even completed the app. So the past 3 weeks, I've done the first four lessons, and the each lesson has a couple videos, and then it has like a quiz, and then a little something that you read to get a little bit more knowledge on.
Oh, okay.
And then so I've gone through four of the lessons. I think there's 10 or 15 lessons on there, so there's more to learn. But even with just the basics of learning the happiness and stress chemicals in your body, I mean, I think there's really some value in it, and certainly actionable items right in the app that I think are awesome for any parent to learn.
Oh, that's great. And it sounds like even further. Now, this may be too specific to parenting for other people to get benefit from it, but it's just a really good example of how, like, there's a very specific idea here, which is like how do your parenting techniques and things like that affect body chemistry and things like that. But bottom line is, even for me as a person who's a single person, it's important to remember that your actions impact others in ways that are far beyond a simple emotional state. So like if I'm extremely positive to another person, it's amazing that you can actually start to see that you can see themselves, that they themselves become more positive because they begin to feed off of that positive energy. And it's true in the opposite too, is that negative people who come in with a real negative attitude, it can make a whole room totally negative.
Yeah, and physiological reactions are real things. Like if you have reactions to another person, even by first looks or by interactions, or like what you were just saying, like if you have negative energy and you're in a conversation, it can definitely feed into that. Like, so if you're in a meeting at work and you're bringing negative energy, I'm sure you've seen it, or if you've seen somebody
Oh,
presenting at work and they
yeah.
have negative energy, then the rest of the people in the meeting just kind of almost get negative and kind of sit back, and they're like, like this is
Right.
terrible, or whatever. And so I mean, physiological changes are real. The scientific chemical things that are happening in your body are real, and I think that's just something that everyone should be aware of.
Absolutely. And if there's nothing else, if people need proof of that, all they need to do is sit around and drink 4 shots of tequila, and they will see what a chemical can do to your body. So just so no,
Exactly.
but that sounds great. That sounds like a good recommendation from you.
Hey, so what is your big thought of the week, Uncle Greg? I'm excited to hear it.
Well, I tell you, Josh, this put a lot of pressure on me because I'm not a person who has particularly good thoughts, and but to kind of like be a good kickoff for the folks that are listening at home and for you as well. I really just sat down and noodled about what's the best headspace to get into before you start down a journey of discovery of like philosophy or just thinking in general. And I was reminded of the this quote by Niels Bohr. And if I remember correctly, he was a physicist, but this has always struck me as being profoundly important to keep in mind, which is that the opposite of a fact is a falsehood, but the opposite of one profound truth may very well be another profound truth. And what he's getting at there is that when we look at life, many things are paradoxical. And if you try to imagine, and just by being paradoxical, the example I use most often is human beings are both animals and self-aware beings. And so that is something that is a tension that people have a hard time with, because when people will make an excuse for a dog just sort of like going crazy, they just go, oh, well, it's just an animal. That we are exactly that same thing. The difference being that we possess self-awareness, and being able, that doesn't mean that we get to excuse our animalistic behavior, but going back to what you were talking about like cortisol levels, there's certain things that happen inside of our bodies that we just react to, that happen before conscious thought. So when we are addressing a new idea, we have an instinct, and this is back to what Niels Bohr is getting at. Our instinct is to say like, well, we know the truth. And in our heads, that ends all conversation about something. But what Bohr is trying to get across to you is that if you look further, there may be something there that is a paradox, a thing that would make you think differently about a concept. And another example would be like using a gun. If somebody comes up and says, you should never, ever use a gun, and that's their truth, that doesn't take into account, and I happen to be a person who believes that things like gun control are very important. But what it doesn't take into account is like, what if you are in the military and you're being trained as part of a unit to protect your fellow soldiers? If you took the idea of never using a gun to heart, then that would make you a very bad soldier. So it's just really important to understand that for any given thought, there's probably, if you think about it, another side of it. It doesn't mean that you should not have strong beliefs, but what it does mean is that it's really important to always keep an open mind on all topics and all subjects, because the lack of an open mind is what traps us into repeating potentially negative behaviors over and over again.
Yeah, and this is, I mean, this is almost like the definition of philosophy, right? Just figuring something out, and there's always more to it. And I think this quote has, you were talking about gun control, and I think in our climate, our political climate, our social climate in the world right now, just realizing that things that are being said, I mean, there's always other truths, and even though one thing may be a truth, there could be other sides to it, and I really like it, and for me, this is almost like mindfulness, just being aware of what lens you're looking at different facts and different problems in the world, and I love this as our thought for the week, and I think I'm going to be thinking about this a lot.
Well, okay, so I've done my job. The one thing I skipped over earlier is that what we decided to do for our first Philosophy Fools Real episode is we're going to be exploring the philosopher Seneca's short essay on the shortness of life, and it can be found anywhere. It's easy to access. You can get it as PDFs. You can get it as audio on YouTube, and it's very short. It's one of the reasons that I wanted us to kick off with this particular piece, is that it doesn't take very long to get through it. I think it's about 24 printed pages, and it contains a lot of really good ideas.
And for people who are going to listen to it on an audiobook on YouTube, it's only about an hour and 20-minute listen. And so it's definitely something that I'm excited about for us to talk about in a couple weeks and get started on it because it has a ton of good information in it.
Okay, that sounds great. So I'm looking forward to it too. And I guess that brings us to the end of our show, Josh.
It was a great show, and it was awesome talking to you this morning. And hopefully that our audience could get some practical applications out of this first episode, even though we didn't even go into any philosophy. Anything else for you?
No, that'll do it. Just want to encourage you and everybody else to stay curious, and we'll talk to you next time.
All right. Take care. Have a good one.
Take care, bud. Hey, Uncle Greg here. Just wanted to thank you for listening this week, and be sure to join us next time when we begin our exploration of Seneca's On the Shortness of Life. And a special thanks to Ted Onulak and Exit 10 for our music. You can check them out at exit10band.com. That's EXIT10band.com.